Okay, this is open Q&A for those who are new, so the ball is in your court. Yeah.
So what would be like the Jewish response to the classic omnipotent paradox of can God make a rock so heavy that he can't lift?
Okay, this will take me probably 5 minutes. I've written about this, it's on my website, but first of all, the idea that God can do anything is surely wrong. For example, would you want to say that God can learn something new? That's a genuine ability. Everyone in this room has it. Do you want to say that God has that ability? Do you want to say that God can improve? That's a genuine ability. Everyone in this room has it. Still, saying that God can improve seems to be somehow off the page, because those abilities, by definition, are had only by imperfect beings. You can only learn something new if you don't already know everything. You can only improve if you're not perfect. If God's definition includes perfection, then those are not abilities that he has. So the idea that God can just do anything is a wrong idea. It has a strong appeal to intuition, but it's wrong. Similarly, with the idea that God has no limits, which is taken to mean you can't deny anything of God, because if you say God is not X, then there's some boundary beyond which God can't go, and then he's limited in that way. But then if God is unlimited in the sense that you can't deny anything of God, anything at all, then one of the things you can't deny of God is limitation. So if he's unlimited, he's got to be limited, and that's just a right contradiction. That's another non-starter. Now that's just to loosen up your intuition. Now, another type of category, which gets a slightly different treatment, is where you ask, can God blank, and you fill in the blank with words that express a contradiction. Can God make a square circle? Can God win a chess with only his king? Can God divide 2 into 5 with no remainder? Can God correctly spell the English word table with exactly 4 letters? If what you fill the blank with is a contradiction, our sources say explicitly, we do not affirm that God can do those things. Notice, we are saying we do not affirm that he can do them. That's not the same as affirming he can't do that. Those are 2 very different propositions. Not affirm means I'm not making a statement, I'm not taking a position. And in fact, Jewish position is I wouldn't affirm that he can do those things, and I wouldn't deny that he can do those things, because there aren't any things to talk about. When you use a phrase that has a self-contradiction, you don't communicate any meaning. So the correct response, if somebody says, can God make a square circle? The correct response is, what? Not yes, not no, but what? Try again. I don't get you. If this isn't already obvious, imagine this. You're on your way to the mall, and a friend calls you up and says, going to the mall? Yes. Can you do me a favor? Sure. Got a spare $25? Yes. Please pick me up a square circle. What would you do now? I think you'd say, could you tell me what you mean? I wouldn't know where to go look for it, in the hardware store, in the library, and in the hobby store. Where would I go looking for a square circle? And if he can't explain himself better, in other words, I think you'd say, I don't know what you mean, so I can't help you. So the correct response to can God X, where X is a contradiction, correct response is to say, I don't know what you mean. You haven't succeeded in asking a question because you've used meaningless words in your description. Now, let's take the particular example of a stone too heavy for God to lift. Can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift? The phrase, stone too heavy for God to lift, is just as bad as square circle. It is a self-contradictory phrase. I will show you. Stone too heavy for God to lift means stone so heavy that for God, who is all-powerful, to lift. Which means stone so heavy that God, who can lift anything, can't lift it. Which means stone so heavy that God can lift it and can't lift it, and that's a contradiction. So the response to the attempted question, can God create a stone too heavy for him to lift, is to say, you have not succeeded in asking a question because you use a form of words to fill the blank. That's self-contradictory, and that communicates no meaning. Now, I will anticipate an objection that may occur to you right away or maybe later. Someone will say, now wait a second, Rabbi. You used to teach logic. Isn't there a rule in logic that you're not supposed to assume what you're trying to prove? It's called begging the question. I thought we were discussing God's omnipotence. That was the subject under discussion. And wondering, is he or isn't he, and how could we prove it, and what problems would we get into if we said so. We're discussing omnipotence. Now you took this phrase, stone too heavy for God to lift, and you started to explain its meaning, and you started by saying, stone too heavy for God, who's omnipotent, to lift. You snuck omnipotence in at the top. You took it for granted. Sure, then you defended yourself by assuming that he's omnipotent. You can defend the conclusion that he's omnipotent, but that's not fair in logic. You can't assume what you're trying to prove. That objection is a mistake. It's a mistake because it mistakes the dialectic. Here's the point, the position of the critic who raises the question about a stone too heavy for God to lift. His position is this. You believe in God? Yes, that's why I wear this hat. You believe God is all-powerful? I say yes. He says, watch me trap you. I will take you and your belief that God is all-powerful, and I will trap you in a contradiction. The challenge is, you can start with your belief that He is all-powerful. I give you that belief, and I'll show you you're in trouble. Your belief is going to get you into trouble. So I say, okay, I'm on for the game. I'm going to start with my belief that God's all-powerful. You trap me. See, he says, can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift? He expects me to answer either yes or no. And he says, if you answer yes, then he can't lift it. If there's no, then it's something he can't do. He can't make the rock. That's his plan. To his surprise, I say, I'm not going to answer yes or no because you haven't asked the question. And I base the fact that he hasn't asked the question on my belief that God is omnipotent. But according to the dialectic, I was allowed to use that. He was going to trap me in my belief in a contradiction. Well, he's failed to do that. That's the right way to, I think, to answer that question. Yeah.
How do you explain doing a mitzvah out of kindness and doing a mitzvah out of mercy?
Kindness and mercy, wow. I would explain the concepts first, whether I would talk about them as ways to do a mitzvah that might be a little bit more extended. But the difference between kindness and mercy in Hebrew, chesed and rachamim, is this. Mercy is always in opposition to justice. Mercy always starts with, don't do justice, delay it, divide it, soften it, accompany it with support. Don't do strict justice. You know, if you're on trial for a crime in the United States, you don't issue a plea for mercy until the verdict is given. Maybe they'll declare you innocent, or I should say not guilty, in which case you don't ask for mercy. You want justice. You're not guilty. But after you've been decided to be guilty, and then it comes to sentencing, then you issue a plea for mercy. Mercy is always, don't do justice. For that reason, I have this from Dovid Kronglass, who was the mashgiach in Nei Yisrael Yeshiva in Baltimore before I got there in 1969. Therefore, mercy has two weaknesses. Number one, mercy always needs a reason. Because mercy starts with don't do justice, and justice says, why not? Excuse me, I'm a very important principle. I have a pay purchase in the world. I shouldn't be honored? Explain why. And number two, mercy has limits, because justice can't be just ignored. It can't be wiped off the map. Kindness is not subject to either of those limitations. Kindness is a starting point. Kindness is an origin point. The beginning of a project can be motivated by kindness. The beginning of a project can be motivated by mercy. Mercy requires a background against which you're applying mercy. So, if I take those concepts literally and strictly, I guess it would depend upon the kind of mitzvah that I was doing. Mercy, I think, would have to be an interpersonal mitzvah.
For charity.
Yeah, with an interpersonal mitzvah. And like the Torah Dvorah writes, the Torah Dvorah says, imagine a case like this. There is an abandoned infant. And you discover that infant and you take it home and you raise it and love it and support it and give it education and experiences that prepare it for life. And then it gets an education and then you take it into your business and you have working together with the business, and then you find out that he's stealing from the business. You're within your rights to be concerned, upset, angry, ferocious, Now, just transfer, this is a method that the Talmud Torah has, just transfer that relationship to your relationship with God. God's responsible for your existence. He gives you all of your assets, all of your abilities, all of your resources. He provides for all of your experiences. And you rebel against him. So then, God would be just as much within his rights to be angry at you as you think that father would be, or if you were the father, with the child who paid you back in such a way. Right? But what does God do? He gives you more breath and more life and more intelligence and more freedom and more room. He gives you more time, right? So if that's what God does for you, and that's what you want from God to do to you, you ought to show that you appreciate that by extending that kind of concern for somebody else. So somebody else treats you the way you treat God, and you want God to treat you with generosity, you treat him with generosity. Now in both cases it's mercy because the person has acted in such a way that in normal terms, he doesn't deserve it. He hasn't earned it. It's a free overlook of his failures to support him in spite of them. That's mercy. Kindness can apply to someone for whom there's no need for mercy because he's done nothing wrong. Indeed, kindness is one of the key chief motivations for having children in the first place. Right? The child doesn't owe you anything. If anything, you owe the child a lot. So that would be the difference between kindness and mercy. But talking about doing a mitzvah, it sounds like you're trying to describe your relationship with God. There, kindness can apply, but mercy cannot. Because God is never unjust. God never needs the special consideration that mercy requires. So when you asked about doing a mitzvah, I was thinking you were putting in the setting of your relationship with God. Their kindness would apply, but mercy would not apply. Yeah?
If I understand correctly, a big way of understanding how that there must be a God in the world is by asking questions of how can it be without it? But the proposed answer that there is a God and that we don't understand him, how does that answer the question if we don't understand the answer either?
When you talk about not understanding, it's not an all or nothing proposition. It's not just do you understand or don't you understand. You can understand some aspects and not other aspects. You can understand something partially but not totally. So I think part of the problem with your question is that you paint it as an all or nothing alternative. Maimonides writes in the Guide, Part 1, Chapter 50, there's a problem of God's having attributes. If God is one, absolutely one in every respect, even that's too weak because of later chapters, but okay. Because if he's one in every respect, every dimension, every connection, and he has 16 attributes, then there's a number 16 that applies to him. Maimonides says, there are people who say, yeah, there are 16 attributes, all right. There's 16 when people have them. When people have these attributes, there are 16 different attributes. But in God, the 16 attributes are one. So he says they are strictly on a par with those Christians who tell you, what is God? Well, God is 3, and God is 1, and 1 is 3, and 3 is 1, and that's the end of the story. Maimonides says, clearly, those are words with no thought behind them. This is what I was telling you before. They're words with no thought behind them. When you say 3, you mean 3 is more than 1. You say 1 is less than 3. So he says, yes, 1, and it's 3, and it's 3, and it's 1, and it's all the same thing, and that's the position. That's not a position. It's words. There's no thought behind it. And he says, Jews who say that the 16 attributes in God are one attribute are saying the same thing. They're talking words, but the words have no thoughts behind them. And if you have no thought behind your words, then you're not expressing something that can be understood. Now, the Ramban had a debate with a renegade Jew who became a Christian. These debates were forced on the Middle Ages on rabbis. King of Aragon forced him to do it. It was a friend of his, actually. But the church was really down his neck. And for 3 days, this is recorded, by the way. It's recorded, even translated into English. Christians were asking Ramban questions, and he was answering. At the end, he said, do I have the right to ask a question? They checked with the church authorities, said, yes, you could ask a question. So he said, you believe in 3 and 1. Is that like 3 peas in a pod? They said, no. Is it like 3 qualities in an object? They said, no. So he gave various examples, and they said, no. And so he said, okay, so you tell me, what do you mean when you say 3 and 1? And the answer he got was, we don't understand it, we just believe it. And he said, if you don't understand it, you can't believe it. Even the translator who translated this passage from the Ramban didn't put it as a footnote that he was taking it from the Rambam, part 1, chapter 50, but that's where it comes from. Now, the naive reader says, now, wait a second, Rabbi. If you can't understand it, you can't believe it? I mean, isn't that exactly what we're supposed to do with respect to God? We don't understand God, we're supposed to believe God? When you say you don't understand, you might mean one of many different things. Here are 3. We talk about something, X, you might not understand why X is what it is, or why it does what it does. You might not understand how X is what it is or does what it does. And you might not understand what X is. Those are 3 different propositions. A great deal of science is devoted to explaining why and how things operate. They can only devote themselves to it and investigate it if they understood what it means to operate and look for the how and why explanations for its operation. There, a lack of understanding triggers investigation and can lead to answers. But if you don't understand what it is, that's another matter. That means the very words that are describing the subject are meaningless words. At that point, you can't claim belief. You can believe that it does, you can believe that it is, but you can't believe it when the IT is replaced by square circle, or stone too heavy for God to lift, or any other nonsensical phrase. 3 and 1 and 1 and 3, there's nothing there to believe. So when you talk about lack of understanding, you have to ask, what is it that we don't understand? Now, God's essence, we don't understand. But we don't understand the essence of light either. Does that cripple us with respect to light? Is light a non-entity for us? Something we can't talk about, can't deal with, can't use? We can, we just don't know its essence. We don't understand what it is that it could operate that way. So quantum mechanics teaches us.
Okay, so why is that a worse question to stay by than how did the world come to being? Why can't I say I don't fully understand how the world came to being, and I'll investigate that? Why do I have to come to the conclusion there must be a God, and now I don't understand what the God is?
Well, again, if I say, why is the room illuminated? And they say, because it's a source of light. And say, but you don't know what light is, but I know what it's doing. Why is that me crippled? Because I don't know what it is. I know what it's doing. I'll just give you this is very well known. You know, until 1965, all educated opinion for thousands of years believed the world has no beginning. So if there was no beginning, then the question, why does it exist, is a weaker question. It always was. It always has been. And if you take the Aristotelian position, then its existence is necessary. It has to be the way it is, then the question evaporates altogether. Put in the Big Bang, it means it wasn't always. It started. That requires some kind of explanation. That demands an explanation. Even Stephen Hawking said so. That's why they concocted the steady state theory to avoid the beginning, which is totally phony, but they concocted it. Just died in 1965. Yes, you can look this up on Wikipedia. So once you say that the world has a beginning and that demands an explanation, you say, well, then I think there has to be something that's responsible for it, that gave it its existence. That's not zero. It's against what people thought when they thought the world was infinitely old. And then you could say, if I have a reason for believing there's something that's responsible for giving it its existence, that opens the door to other questions about it, which I might be able to investigate. For example, if it gave the world its existence, then it isn't subject to the operating principles of the world, then I could look for exceptions in the principles of the world, like exceptions to the laws of nature, which would be responsible to being caused by that being. Since he's behind it and he's more powerful than it, then he can make exceptions for it. So this suggestion would have follow-up investigations, which it implies, for which you could derive evidence. So it's not nothing, because I don't understand the essence. It's too simplistic a picture of how science works. Yeah.
So would there be incorrect reasoning on a part of a Jew who looks at scientific findings in the field of biology or cosmology and comes to the conclusion to trust the experts in these fields, since the Jew or they themselves aren't experts, and as such adapt these views that may be contradictory to that of the Torah?
I don't think I could give a general answer to that question that would be applicable in all cases. A person who's wondering about how to relate science to Torah, I would recommend a heavy dose of history of science. The number of principles over the last 500 years were thought to be absolute, proven, necessary, obvious, and clearly true, which were abandoned one by one. In 1898, one of the greatest American physicists discouraged his graduate students from going into physics as a research area because there's no research left to be done. We have it all nailed down. We're just experimentally confirming the fifth decimal place of our observations. It's a boring field with nothing left to be done. Well, that was before relativity, before quantum mechanics, and So even Stephen Hawking made the same mistake. And Max Born said it in 1928. We have the equation for the electron. Look at the equation for the proton. There are only two particles. It's all over. Now there are 64 or 128, depending on how you count, and so forth and so on. And when he wrote A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking said exactly the same thing. Yes, they made the mistake, and they made the mistake, but now it's around the corner because we really have his no-boundary condition theory of how the universe evolves. Will do the job. It didn't do the job. So my first suggestion would be that he should have a strong dose of history of science. And let me give you the parable that I use for this purpose. Imagine a Jew in 1920. And he's a believing Jew, and in the Torah it says, in the beginning, roughly it says, with the troubles of the translation, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And one of his friends who's been to university and read up on the current latest scientific finding system, in the beginning, come on, there never was a beginning. I mean, even the ancients knew that. Aristotle knew that, and every educated person understands that the world has no beginning. How can you believe that? So he starts reading around, looking around, and this guy's actually right. Every educated person, whether in sciences or in philosophy, they all take it for granted. The Hubble expansion of the universe, the steady state theory solved that. There's no beginning to the universe, even though it's expanding, right? And he dies in 1964. Well, by 1953, he's given up Torah, he's eating cheeseburgers and everything else. He dies in 1964. But in 1965, the steady state theory collapses, and there's a big bang, and there is a beginning. Gee, that's really too bad, So there used to be a book and a movie called Rush to Judgment. I think here, history should teach us that rushing to judge that this has been established by science and is known, and we have to figure out a way to reinterpret Torah to agree with it. If you have a strong dose of history of science, you'll see that that's very naive. one of the people that I used to teach in university is Charles Sanders Peirce, who was the founder of American pragmatism. And in one of his papers on philosophy of science, he has a long footnote where he just catalogs the absolute certainties in the scientific world century by century, and of course they were discarded one by one. 100 years ago, I said, what do you study in science? Cause and effect. Really? Yeah, that's what science is about, cause and effect. Then quantum mechanics isn't science, because lots of things happen without causes. Just too bad, right? Well, the world is an objective reality, and we're studying it to understand it. Really? According to many interpretations of quantum mechanics, we are participants in that reality. We make that reality into what it is. So what is it that you're really holding fast to? What is it that you really know and you've really pinned down? I went through, there's the wonderful book called The Dinosaur Heresies by a fellow named Backer, I forget his first name, written in the 70s. Dinosaurs were first thought to be reptiles, and the exhibits in museums of the bones were put up with splayed feet, like reptiles walk. Turns out they didn't walk that way, they walk straight up and down. And many of them were warm-blooded, not cold-blooded. They just made assumptions, you see, and assumptions on the basis of associations and so on and so on. How about intelligence on the evolutionary tree? The tree is a mistake. It's full of, there's 3 different criteria for the tree, and they all disagree. They don't tell you that. There's a paleontologist, and there's 2 different molecular clocks, and they don't agree on the tree. But what about closest on the tree? It turns out that some birds are smarter than chimpanzees. I don't think we're very close. We're not as close to birds as we are to chimpanzees somehow, but these birds can solve problems that chimpanzees can't. All these things are full of surprises and mistakes. Junk DNA, one of the concrete predictions of Darwinistic variation selection, turns out to be greatly, greatly mistaken, if not totally mistaken. More and more discoveries are being made every day. Every week there are new discoveries of what's going in the interior of a cell, and it's just naive to have thought that we understood things to the point where you could declare it's junk. I had my tonsils out when I was a kid because they were infected. In those days, you took out the adenoids automatically because they certainly don't do anything. And why have them? They could get infected. And then we found out that they do things. The appendix really does have an effect on your health. And because it was declared a vestigial organ, no research was done. But then when they discovered that it harbors bacteria, they did a study of a certain type of surgical condition. They found out that people without appendices are more likely to have post-surgical problems than people with appendices. So all these things which we know and have to reformulate Torah to agree with them, I think it's very naive. I think that, I think it's very naive. Yeah.
Pardon me for assuming to add on to what you say, but in my experience, the popular perception of what the science says is often very different from what the experts actually publish. But very few people read the articles. They just go with the, what you see on TV and in movies. So that's also...
I agree with you, and I would go even further than you. They go with the Science Digest of the New York Times and with CNN, which are not just movies. And they also don't read the papers. They read the digest of the papers, and they take their headlines and their articles from there. And it's very difficult to get genuine scientific understanding. Now, you may have, when you started your question, I want to make a remark about that as well. People are looking and they're not experts, and and relying on experts. I want to make 2 remarks. First of all, there are 2 types of experts. One type of expert knows more than you do, but he speaks your language, and he could explain to you where he's coming from and what his evidence is. And the experts do write popular books. For the popular subject, it's a big moneymaker. So one of my sources of scientific knowledge, except for the area where, my field was philosophy and mathematics. There I published in the field. But other than that, I read the books written by someone like Stephen Hawking, who is not just a New York Times reporter, the book that he himself wrote. And I think I'm getting genuine material there. So he may know more than I do, but he's writing a book to me to explain his position. So I think it's fair for me to evaluate what he wrote. What was his name? The fellow is a professor of law at Berkeley who did a review of some of the literature in evolutionary biology, Philip Johnson. And he said, I don't know anything about science, but I know about arguments. That's my field. I'm a professor of law. So I decided to check the logic in the arguments. Could have been pixies. I don't know, but I know this proposition, this proposition, this proposition, and the logic tells you that proposition. I'm a master of logic. And I'll show you the mistakes and weaknesses that I found in the articulation of these fields. The other type of expert is a person who's mastered material that can't be communicated, like in higher mathematics. There, I think you have to simply forswear any attempt to evaluate what the person is doing. That's one thing. That's direct evaluation, but there's indirect evaluation. This I saw in a paper maybe 20 years ago. I was very impressed. This guy said, I'm interested in this field. I don't know anything about the field, and there's controversy in the field. I can't master the material of the field, but I can read the writings of the people on the various sides of the controversy, and I can estimate their character. Are they generous to the other side? Do they use ad hominem attacks rather than content attacks? Do they try to use political pressure or academic pressure to penalize people who disagree with them? Do they ever admit mistakes? Do they ever admit there are any weaknesses in their position? And if I find a systematic difference between the character of the people on one side versus the other side, then I think I have some reason to trust the side whose representatives are people who admit mistakes and admit places where their position is not perfect and still needs further research, and who quote their critics fairly and respond to them in a polite and respectful tone. I think that makes a big difference in the credibility of the two sides. So I think that can be done also. And I think, especially in the evolutionary debate, it's devastating if you make an exploration of that type. Absolutely devastating. Yeah. Yes.
I also have a question. I have great respect for the Jewish tradition of approaching the concept of God with logic and philosophy and determining what is necessary and trying to feel out the idea. But how certain are we that the information that we have, that we take as given down at Sinai, how certain are we that they are the same thing?
What and what are the same thing? The information of Sinai and what?
Oh, let me rephrase, sorry. The information that we have that was given at Sinai, that's what we assume. How certain are we that information describes the philosophical idea that we know of as God? How do we, for instance, what if there was a bad actor involved that gave us bad information at Sinai? How would we know that?
Okay. There are several questions in the neighborhood of your words, but for example, you might ask, from 1,000 years after Sinai to 2,000 years after Sinai, how was the transmission? That's one question you could ask. You're talking about the event itself. Well, the
transmission is accurate.
Well, but then the question is where the question is going to be located. For example, our description of Sinai is of a mass revelation. There was no agent who communicated to the people. On the contrary, all the people heard God speak simultaneously.
Right.
So the question of the agent communicating doesn't start. That's not the picture of the event. That's one of the key differences between Jewish religion and all other religions. All other religions depend upon some person who has credibility somehow. Here, they tell the following story. A Hasidic Rebbe died, and two of his sons were vying for the leadership of the group. And after a few months, one came to the group one day and said, I know that I'm the one who should be chosen as the leader because my father of blessed memory came to me in a dream last night and told me that I should be the leader. And one of the Hasidim said, if your father had wanted to verify that you should be the leader, he shouldn't have come to you in a dream. He should have come to us in a dream. Quite right. Exactly right. Now, another religion begins with someone who says, I'm special. Look at me. I'm really different. I'm special. Listen to me. I'll tell you what God wants. as we say in Hebrew, Oshkein Shalom. Maybe yes, maybe no. Who knows? That's why it's crucial that the Jewish religion starts with an account of a public revelation. No one depended on anyone else at all. Everyone heard for himself. So the question at that point of someone making up information doesn't arise. Whereas for other religions, it does arise.
No, that's not my question. I didn't phrase it correctly. Assuming that our understanding of what happened at Sinai is accurate, and that there was a mass revelation and everyone got the same information transmission has been accurate, all that is good. How confident are we that the source of that information is in fact the God that we try to approach using logic and philosophy? How do we know that it isn't a God-like being who's messing with us?
Oh, I see. Okay, so now I see. I misunderstood your use of the word philosophy. You see, philosophy can be divided into two broad realms. There's philosophy as in the study of knowledge, epistemology, or the study of the basic categories of reality, which is called metaphysics, or the study of value, which is called value theory. That's one definition of philosophy, which could be called pure philosophy. Then there's what's called philosophy of law, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of science. There you have an ongoing project, and you use philosophical tools to clarify that project. That's the kind of philosophy we do.
Right.
We don't do pure philosophy.
Yeah.
We do philosophy of, we do a lot of that. But that is now part and parcel of the tradition itself. The texts of the tradition have investigations into that kind of philosophy. So the question now is whether the philosophy that we use, our internal philosophy, not Descartes, not Pascal, we're talking about the philosophical tools we use to clarify the concepts that we are using, which we received from prophecy itself. So there, I would say, this is a tradition. A tradition comes with a methodology together with the information, and we've used that methodology. I don't think there's a serious question as to whether, the methodology isn't the methodology that we received. It is true that certain historians have opined that we took this from India and we took this from Greece and so forth and so on. If you look into their claims carefully, which I have done and I've actually published on, you can see that it's a very, very weak proposition.
Well, again, I think my words betray me. I've spoken to many people about this, and often the approach is, well, the universe exists, God is necessary. It's difficult to speak about, but there are ideas, there are concepts which are bundled together under the term God, and people state that this is necessary, that the universe cannot function without this bundle of ideas actually existing. I guess Whitey could explain it better than I do.
Look, I think maybe we should have to open up the floor, but we start from a certain historical experience.
Yeah.
And the ideas and concepts and techniques we use are largely to explain the content and the nature of those experiences. So we're not doing an abstract investigation into the laws of nature and how could they be necessary and what kind of being would have to be behind them. Well, an investigation which we carried out by a Chinese philosopher or an Indian philosopher, we're not doing that. We're starting with already existing material and drawing out its philosophical implications. That material came to us from the revelation at Sinai, from subsequent prophecy, which went on for 1,000 years, and from the analysis that the scholarly class put into analyzing that material. So I think maybe we're starting from a different place from the philosophy that you're talking about. So maybe
it's not about the methodology. It's to put it very bluntly. How do we know that our traditions and everything that we our methodology, our facts, everything? How do we know that the source of all of that information is God and not a God impersonator of immense power?
Okay, I'll just answer you briefly. I have a whole chapter in my book on this. When you ask how do you know it's not, what your words are searching for is a proof. I think proof is wrong. It's a wrong goal. One shouldn't talk in terms of proofs altogether, because the word proof implies certainty, infallibility, necessity. Nothing is like that. I called my book Reason to Believe. What you want is good reason. So then it's not enough to think up an alternative and ask me to rule out the alternative. What you need to do is find an alternative for which you have positive evidence that it's true, and then weigh up your positive evidence that it's true against my positive evidence that it's not true. So the critic is not to rely just on his imagination. I mean, and I think that changes the dialectic very significantly.
It does. I'll read your book.
Okay. Yeah, who else? Yeah.
So of interest, you mentioned now that you're saying that the person who sees, you don't change the Torah to fit science because you see often the science changes. But you're saying therefore shouldn't make a presupposition that the Torah is going to be wrong and maybe it's the science that's wrong. I'm just saying surely then you should also wonder maybe the Torah got it wrong and science will eventually discover something that will make the Torah superfluous, for example. For example, how the universe, let's say, wouldn't need and they bring conclusive proofs for that. So just if you can make the argument one way, kind of make it the other way.
I didn't make an appeal just to possibility. I didn't say, look, there's no necessity that they're right. It might be that they're wrong, and therefore you shouldn't rush to the chat. I said, I have positive evidence over a 500-year period, a 1,000-year period, 2,000-year period of radical changes in their position. You don't have that with respect to Torah. You don't have us changing our position all the time. On the contrary, our position is very consistent. So the two sides, if that's the terms in which you're comparing them, one has built into it a skepticism that in 100 years they're going to believe what they believe today. And that makes reconciling myself to what they believe today an empty pursuit. I don't see that you can say that on the other side. If we were changing our views all the time for whatever reason, then you could say, well, maybe we'll have to change our views tomorrow. But we haven't been doing that. So I don't see that there's a comparison between the two sides. Yeah, well, yeah.
Can the Rabbi explain a little bit about how connection with God works? How do we know that we're actually connecting to God, and how do we connect to Him?
Well, again, if you ask how do you know, my translation of that is how do we have good reason to think so, not how do I know and how do I know it's not, because then again you're just thinking up possible alternatives. How do I know that I'm connecting to a person? How do how maybe the person is just like paranoics think, just trying to get me to believe and lower my guard and lower my attention so he can stab me in the back, right? How do I know it's not true? So at a certain point you say, well, there's a certain consistency of evidence supporting this proposition, and the alternative is supported only by possibility. I go with the balance of evidence. That, I think, is what rationality requires, going with the balance of evidence. You do that in science, you do that in personal relationships, you do it everywhere. So to abandon that, because this is an abstract investigation, there's high stakes, and say, I want to be able to rule out every possible alternative. Now, we have a lot of experience with God. I believe, for example, let's take Abraham. Now, I haven't seen other people say this. The Rambam, my monitor treats it in a different way. I'm offering something to add. I'm not criticizing anything in this tradition, but I'm adding something. God says to Abraham, sacrifice your son. And he accepts it. Is there any reason for him to accept it? Well, let's ask what experience he's had with that voice. That voice said, leave your homeland, and you're going to have children. Decades and decades go by. He's 99, she's 99, they have a child beyond all possible natural possibility. There's a war, and his nephew is captured. 4 kings against 5 kings. 4 kings complete a successful military sweep of the whole area. And one night, Abraham and his followers defeat that whole army and free his neighbor. They get down to Egypt, and the Pharaoh kidnaps Sarah, and there's a plague on the whole house of Pharaoh, and he sets her free and gives Abraham gifts. Same thing happens decades later with Avimelech, and he takes Sarah into the palace, and Avimelech has a terrible dream, and God comes to him and says, you're going to die because of this woman you have taken into your palace. She's a married woman. And he gets up in the morning, he calls his whole kingdom together and tells them, this is a terrible thing, look what's happened here, we're in danger, and so forth and so on. How many times does it take to get you to realize you're dealing with a being who's very powerful, who's very consistent, who's very interested, he can manage wars, he can manage supernatural births, he can overwhelm the power of kings. We're not talking about your next door neighbor here, Philip Cohn from down the street. So now this being says to you, sacrifice your son. So here you're at a tipping point. Well, does sound extreme, but on the other hand, a lot of extreme things have been happening consistently for 60 years. So at a certain point, I think it would be reasonable to say, I don't understand. This I don't understand. But maybe, in this case, something very important has to happen that I don't understand. Must I understand everything? Do I think I'm qualified to understand everything? There was a great, celebrated, saintly man called Albert Schweitzer, who was a doctor. I think he played the organ. He was a very educated and cultured person. And he went to Africa to treat the natives for years. Now, imagine the following thing. He cures their infections, and he births their babies, and he cures, he sets splints for their broken limbs, and the limbs all cure, and rashes, and let's say he does, therapies of various kinds. One day, a native comes in with gangrene in his foot, and now Schweitzer says, "Sorry, we have to take off the foot." Take off the foot. Why? Because otherwise you're going to die. But you've been here for years. Every time you've cured us. You've restored us to functionality. You're going to take off my foot? I'm sorry, in this case, there's nothing else to do. Now should he say, oh, he broke it, he's gone crazy, he's been taking drugs, this is good. Or maybe, look, he's been here, he's dedicated to us, he could have been in New York, making $1 million. If he tells us that this time I have to lose my foot, it's probably right, and it's probably, although it's different and contradicts my previous experience in some ways, he's probably right. I think it's reasonable. By the way, I would define emunah, which is sometimes translated as faith, I would define emunah as rational trust. Trust means you operate on something you don't personally understand, but there can be good reason to trust, like you trust your doctor when he makes a prescription for a medicine. The medicine will be good for you. You don't know the pharmacology or the physiology that the medicine is based on, but you trust him to do what's good for you. Same thing is true that God can earn your trust also. So at a certain point, the consistency gives rise to the rational expectation that this too is for some reasonable project, even though I don't understand. Of course, at the end, we see that it was because it was called off at the very last minute. And Abraham couldn't have known that. Abraham had to go through it thinking that he was going to kill his son. Anyway, I think that's where the confidence can come from, and it's that which we're meditating on, trying to understand and trying to relate to. Now you talk about relating to God. There are certain things that you do, certain types of experiences, which are recorded in the literature as godly experiences. You need an external reference, otherwise it could be just imagination. But you see that, you see for yourself that there are experiences different from the kinds of experiences that you have under other conditions. It isn't just like listening to Beethoven or reading Shakespeare. It touches you in a different way. And I think that from our point of view, the tradition goes back to prophecy, and prophecy was verified with miracles. And these people have delivered us the results of those experiences. We have every right to understand that these experiences, since they come from the same tradition which was verified by miracles, is coming from the same source, and it has the same background.
Many religions have, Islam, Christianity, all have prophets. They all have recorded prophecies.
They have recorded material from people whom they gave great veneration to. That doesn't make them prophets. A prophet in our tradition has to do something which is clearly beyond the natural. Foretell the future in detail. Try Nostradamus if you have any critical bone in your body. Nostradamus predicted what the president would say under that condition, but it's written in Old French. And they don't tell you that for every 3 words that he wrote, they put in 100 words. Try it and see whether the kinds of predictions that are made were verified in history. Take a look at the prediction of conquest and exile that was made. I have that whole chapter in my book on that subject, and see whether you can have anything that's comparable to to the prophecies that we have that we know are verified. I don't think there's anything comparable there at all. They speak what for them are inspiring words. They do that. They fire them up. But that's not the same as saying something or doing something verifiable. The Torah tells us that Saul, before he became king, was searching for a herd of donkeys that was his father lost. And he had a servant with him. And they're searching. And the servant says, why are we searching? Shmuel, the prophet, is here. Prophets know things. They know things that other people don't know. He'll know where the donkeys are. He was called a chozeh in those days, a seer. S-E-E-R is seer, someone who sees. They went to him and he said, yeah, the donkeys are over there. That's verifiable. Right? Show me a Muslim imam that could do that. Okay, I have to go teach it in another place.